Next time I come here, I'll bring a couple of double again. That's great.
Then after the talk, I just stay front, take the questions, right?
Yes, there will be questions from the audience, but also on
On-
Zoom, they
yeah.
type them in.
Sure.
Oh, okay.
How are you? Good, thank you. Are you got loose? Michigan, correct.
Uh-huh.
Yep.
Yeah, that originates trickle in, so maybe we'll give it another couple of minutes.
Sure. Doesn't tend to go over time, so we should.
Yeah, I think it'd be good. How many are in Zoom session?
It's like 15.
And we're gonna do the word for the life. This should.
Around 6:05 or something. Minutes. Okay.
So what does the audience isn't hearing us, right? They're just.
No, they're very nice. We're not very loud. So change those portions out.
Good.
It's evidence underlying good people.
Okay.
Just a question. I had the question.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, good question. Okay, so I go ahead.
Absolutely. So that's option.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to our first Promise Armenian Institute hosted event of the 2024-25 academic year. My name is Professor Ann Karagosian. It is my privilege as the director of the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA to welcome you to this in-person lecture and simultaneous Zoom webinar entitled Writing Against Stalin's Western City, Mkrtich Armen's Yerevan, 1931, and the Specter of the New East, or Nord Arevelk. The lecture is to be delivered by Dr. David Leupold, who is a research fellow at the Leibniz Zentrum Moderne Orient in Berlin. His lecture will explore the urban development of Armenia's capital, Yerevan, during the late Soviet and early post-Soviet period, and alternative theories thereof. This talk actually is the third in a three-part lecture series delivered by Dr. Leupold in the United States. The first one was delivered at the University of Michigan Center for Armenian Studies on the subject of, for us, the deserts are bustling cities, early Soviet Yerevan between Armenian futurism and post-Persian retropia. The second lecture was delivered at UC Berkeley's Armenian Studies program, and that was entitled Kommunism, Soviet Constructionism, Armenian Surrealism, and the Waking Dream of the City of Commune Houses. So we are doubly or even triply grateful to David for traveling to the US and to these various universities to deliver 3 different lectures and share with us his very interesting research. I'm also pleased to note that this event is co-hosted by the UCLA Richard Hovannisian Endowed Chair in Modern Armenian History and is co-sponsored by the UCLA Center for Near Eastern Studies, the Center for Armenian Studies at the University of Michigan, the UC Berkeley Armenian Studies Program, the Arevelk Museum, and the National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, or NASR. We are grateful for the support of all of our co-sponsors. And on behalf of the UCLA co-sponsors, I would like to acknowledge our presence on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the indigenous Gabrielino Tongva peoples. It is a privilege for our institution to acknowledge the history of the land on which we are established. Before we move on with our program and introduction of our speaker, let me mention a few procedural items. First, let me note again that this event is being recorded for future viewing at our UCLA Promise Armenian Institute YouTube channel and is visible now on Zoom and YouTube. For those in the audience here, when the talk is concluded, please feel free to raise your hand and ask questions. For those of you watching the Zoom webinar, watching via the Zoom webinar platform, please pose questions using the green Q&A button and type in a question. In all cases, please try to make your questions as succinct and clear as possible for our speaker. And by the way, for those on Zoom, in the very unlikely event that the Zoom webinar drops for any reason, please just connect right back to the same link and you should be back in our Zoom session. So now I am very happy to introduce to you Professor Sebu Aslanian from UCLA's Department of History, who's connecting with us remotely from New York. Professor Aslanian is the holder of the Richard Hovannisian Endowed Chair in Modern Armenian History, and his research focuses on early modern and modern Armenian history. So Sebu, I will turn the webinar over to you for an introduction of our speaker.
Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you all for being here. It's a great pleasure for me to address and welcome everyone and our speaker today, and my regret that I cannot join you in person. So we are truly honored today to have Dr. David Leupold joining us for what promises to be a very interesting and stimulating lecture. The lecture explores Yerevan's urban trajectory as a site of what Dr. Leupold calls embattled urbanity, and will explore the ways in which, despite its criticisms and trenchant criticisms in places, the indelible mark of Alexander Tamanyan, the architect of Yerevan, remains persistent throughout most of the 20th century. So after my brief introduction of Dr. Leupold's biography. I will then invite him to the virtual podium. He will give a talk of approximately 50 minutes, following which we will open the floor to a Q&A period. And in this context, to reiterate what Dr. Aragosian mentioned a short while ago, to the audience members, I ask you to write down your questions as succinctly as possible and submit them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your webinar screen. Once the talk is over, we will host as many questions. We will entertain as many questions as possible and look forward to this stimulating talk. But before I pass the podium to David, let me introduce him and say a few more things than what's said so far. Dr. David Leupold is a sociologist and research fellow at the Leibniz Zentrum Moderner Orient, Berlin. And he was a 2018 to 2019 Manoukian postdoctoral fellow at the University of Michigan at the Department of Sociology and holds a doctoral degree from the Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin with research interests focusing on contested geographies and collective imaginations of past, present, and future in the post-Ottoman and post-Soviet space, a topic that is very germane in this day and age, given all the contesting visions of land and history that have animated too many conflicts, perhaps for our well-being. So his first monograph, titled Embattled Dreamlands at the Nexus of Armenian, Kurdish, and Turkish Memory Politics, published by Routledge in New York in 2020, was the recipient of a 2021 annual book prize of the Central Eurasian Studies Society. So without further ado, I join you. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Leupold to the podium, and thank you, David, for accepting our invitation and making all of this possible today. I'm really looking forward to learning from your stimulating talk.
So yeah, thanks a lot. First of all, really thanks a lot, and thanks a lot, Sebo, for this kind introduction, and most importantly, thanks a lot, Hasmik, for all the organizational efforts that really made it possible for me to be standing here at this point, 8 years actually after for the first time visiting UCLA back then as a graduate student.
Give me 1 second.
Sure, no problem. I will be starting in like a second. We're just connecting the PowerPoint presentation, which I think happens exactly at this moment. All right. So the talk, first of its kind, offers already an initial glimpse into chapter 1 of what will be my upcoming second monograph, provocatively titled The Death and Life of Southern Soviet Cities, Urban Futures and Their Afterlives, obviously in allusion to Jane Chekhov's scathing critique of architectural modernism. So in some sense, one could think of it as a kind of critique of the critique. In this book, I depart from a central question, which is, what does life after the future look like? What does it mean 3 decades after the fall of state socialism to live, to inhabit cities designed for a future that never arrived? So in exploring this question, what is left of the future city? That's a play on words that I borrow from Ronald Sunni. This book seeks not only to trace the material and mnemonic remnants left by Soviet urbanization, but to reveal how Soviet discourse on cities sometimes sparked radical ideas that transcended the constraints of state socialism itself. That is, they were politically left of Soviet politics. Rather than approaching Soviet urbanism here as a rigid and closed system, the research weaves together diverse threads into a polyphonic account of how the Southern republics approached urbanization, reconstructing here distinct urban futures and their afterlives. So if we now move into the index of the envisaged book, we see here that it departs from after a first conceptual chapter, It engaged with the notion of bottom-up urbanity, looking here at the efforts of Czechoslovak internationalists to construct an international city in the Central Asian steppe, known later as Bishkek or Frunze at that time, and how this speaks also to current debates about reclaiming the city from below. Then we see work moving more towards the the post-Stalinist period, looking at polycentric urbanity, that is urban planning experiments also in Central Asia with prefab housing, and how it, however, also speaks to current debates on the 15-minute city, something that is widely discussed with regard to Paris, Bogota, but also in different cities within China. And then we see also the notion of ecocentric urbanity that moves already a bit towards the late Soviet period, the vision of a Jewish philosopher and a Georgian-Russian biochemist to transform a Naukograd, a science town on Moscow's outskirts by the name of Pushina, into the USSR first ecopolis, and how this, of course, speaks to current debates on the biomorphic urbanity and on the sustainable city at large. What we will zoom in for today's talk will be a variation or a part of what constitutes chapter 3, that is on indigenized urbanity, or one might also say cosmolocal urbanity. We will discuss Armenian futurist quest, specifically focusing here on one particular writer, to root Soviet Armenian architectural style in both the region's post-Persianate heritage and visions of an internationalist future, and how this relates to current ethno-national conflicts today. Get you out of this panelka. Now we're here. When the Soviet Union collapsed, the statue of Lenin was swiftly removed from the Republic Square in Yerevan, beheaded and tossed into the backyard of the History Museum, in case someone wonders where to find him, or part of what is left of him. Yet the statue of another man shall outlive the fall of the USSR and continue to throne over the capital of a now independent Armenia. It is the statue of Alexander Tamanyan, the master planner or city builder, in Soviet speech, gradostроитель, of Soviet Yerevan, which continues to occupy a prominent site at the very heart of the present-day city. Almost a century later, Tamanyan's architectural legacy from the Stalin era is still regarded as virtually untouchable, whether Jim Torosyan's late Soviet construction of the Cascade or the prestigious post-Soviet mega project of UCLA Pogoda, Northern Avenue. From the 1920s until today, the spatial arrangement envisioned by Tamanyan constitutes the unchallenged urban paradigm and reference point that continues to inform urban development in Armenia's capital. Tamanyan's architecture, for those not familiar with it, can be described as a blend of Armenian medieval architecture with wider traditions of Western neoclassicism, in an effort to forge a paradigmatic style retrospectively framed as Neo-Armenianism. Tamanyan's signature building, the People's House of Yerevan, or the future Yerevan Opera, constitutes here, in his own words, an attempt at combining the spatial ideas of the Roman Colosseum and Zvartnots. The later here refers to the ruins of a 7th century Armenian church built during the first Muslim-Arab raids. Faithful here to the monumental Karenization and its promise of national cultural emancipation, Tamanyan's syncretic approach can be understood of what would be understood as the architectural reconstruction of authentic Haïtzion Armenianness. However, ironically, the construction required here the demolition of a medieval Armenian chapel, which had happened to occupy the place where the opera was established, was built in the 12th or 13th century. I quote here from Levon Abramian, one of the leading social anthropologists of Armenia. Tamanyan was looking back not at the recent past, but at a far more distant past. His retrospective view was aimed at the ancient past that he had invented. And the topic sparked a recent debate when Mark Grigorian, head of the National Museum Institute of Architecture, revealed plans by Tamanyan to demolish Kont. Ultimately spared the fate of destruction, Kont is now celebrated and enjoyed as Yerevan's possibly last entire Persia-era vernacular district. In light of this critical re-evaluation of Yerevan's 20th century history, I want my talk to move away from the Neo-Armenian city Tamanyan built towards the Yerevan that vanished and the Yerevan that was imagined, yet has remained largely unbuilt. Here we encounter, of course, a strong epistemic asymmetry, which makes for an extremely unequal pair of comparison. For the first, Tamanyan's project of the new Armenian city, which has been firmly inscribed into the material landscape of today's city, literally chiseled into the characteristic pink touchstone that everyone who has visited Yerevan will without doubt remember. In stark contrast to this, the historical trajectory of his opponents, fallen from favor under Stalinism and ultimately repressed, has survived if only as a silenced and distinctly fragmented legacy. Blueprints stored away in private archives and written testimonies in the form of autobiographical writings and, what is subject to this talk, fiction alike. So blending here urban sociology and the 20th century history of the Caucasus with Armenian literature and also Iranian philology, I seek to reconstruct what one could call a counter-narrative to Tamanyan's Yerevan. So in this talk, I will specifically confine myself to focus on one man who maybe provided the most eloquent and most radical critique, Mkrtich Armen. Born 1906 into the family of an Armenian craftsman in Alexandropol, also known as Lenin, also known as Gyumri nowadays, at the time of that mid-sized Tsarist city. Upon graduating from the Moscow State Institute of Cinematography, he works on the ground as teacher in the newly formed reading huts and as a youth scout in Soviet Kazakhstan. After his return to Armenia, however, he settles in Yerevan and adopts the pen name Mkrtich Armen and to pursue his career as a writer. In 1926, so 3 years after the publication of his first poem, Transcaucasia or Other Caucasus, he produces a short story that bears here the ominous sounding name Hotakvohokinere Pohotsum, or In the Streets of Drowning Souls. Ostensibly modeled on Armen himself, the story's main protagonist, a young communist by the name of Aram, travels from village to village propagating the benefits of a new socialist way of life. Walking along a country road, before his imaginary eyes materializes the oniric, dreamlike image of the Communashen, or Communopolis, possibly also city of communes, difficult to translate. Let's zoom in on the text. Gazing at the fields spread around me, I would ponder, from this field to the distant mountain lies a vast expanse. Who knows? Perhaps in a few decades, a great city will spread out here, and it will be named Communashen. Every time I passed by the future site of Communashen, I was filled with its beautiful vision. Since travelers were rare on the village road during that season, I spent more and more time envisioning Communashen. It got to the point where I began to map out the city, designing streets and buildings. I would build, demolish, and rebuild until the city took its final form, complete with all the conveniences fitting each member of a common society. To this day, I'm convinced that if one day I were appointed as the chief architect of Communashen, I would not make a mistake. That day too, there was no one else visible on the road to the village, so I began to lay out a tram line through the streets of Communashen. But Anahit stood before my thoughts and would not leave. So who is this Anahit? Anahit, the main protagonist's big crush, assumes in the story plot the role of an antagonist. Though most of her background story is shrouded in silence, Anahit appears to be born into a clerical family, indicated by a former honorific prefix Ter, which she defiantly continues to use. At their first encounter, she introduces herself provocatively as Anahit, surname Ter Karapetyan, but as there's no longer any Ter, so Lord Master left, just Karapetyan. Upon being asked about her family, she just laconically notes that her parents are dead and that, aside from her flatmate, she is absolutely alone. The way, however, she stresses absolutely, Patsaratsakarpes, has something clearly uncanny that deeply churns and concerns Aram. Chances are that her parents might have fallen victim to the violence that ensued the Bolsheviks' violent rise to power. So while Aram's imagination is animated by the waking dream of the Communopolis, Anahit appears to the reader as a apathetic and embittered character, showing little to no interest in the emancipatory promises brought along by socialist urbanity. Portrayed here as a woman imbued with, I quote here from the novel, old-fashioned or old psychology of a pre-revolutionary patriarchal world, she is haunted not only by pathological jealousy, but also a persistent, one could say, proclivity for toxic masculine partners. After both part their ways, Aram notes with spite about her future husband of Anahit, I quote, a strange fella who was not member of the Komsomol, ni Ansanotra Vochkomeritakan. Her husband loved her very dearly. Anahit boasted about him beating up 3 guys and slapping 2 others just because of her. That's how dearly he loved her. So while his separation from Anahit is clearly to be read as an inevitable break with the old world, the novel, however, and that's interesting, retains an unusual tragic undertone that leaves the reader in an unresolved state. At the end of the story, Aram takes out a wrinkled photograph of Anahit, which he had kept with him after their love ended, and promises to himself, I will erect a memorial for you, Anahit. I loved you deeply. Though you're gone now, I cherish your memory still. Let the residents of Kommunashen know, as they pass by your memorial, that despite my profound love for you, I chose to build it on the streets of Drowning Soul, so hence the title of the story, where for now a field is sown and the golden yellow trees sway gently. But how is this act to be understood? As a way of eternalizing Anahit and the past she embodies, or as a way of banishing it in the forever bygone of a musealized and monumentalized past? In a 1928 review of the short story published in Literary Positions, a critic by the name of Dabagian wondered, why could the drowning souls not become the inhabitants of the new world? And what does this reveal about the unresolved conflict? The response to this question is not provided in the narrative. So Armen's Street of Drowning Soul appears here like a shadow zone, a liminal space where the utopias of the new world, reified by Kommunashen, become entangled in the lingering vestiges of the old world. And that's quite literally, just like Aram becomes entangled here in the web of passion that ties him to Anahit. This maddening love testifies here to the enduring potency of the old world to haunt as an object of desire the dreams of even the most steadfast Komsomol activists like Aram. Thus, Anahit transpires here in the story in 2 guises. Firstly, in the guise of a pure antagonist, neatly separated from the protagonist, and secondly, in the guise of a spectral wish image, deeply ingrained in the new revolutionary subject's own imagination. So while Aram's waking mind is animated by the dreams of his future commonopolis, the fantasies that structure his subconscious drag him towards a yearning for the old, that is, towards what the Polish sociologist Zygmunt Bauman calls retrotopia, that is a yearning for a romanticized past in response to what the political scientist Stephen Smith called the modernity and its discontents, in allusion to Freud, of course. So Armen's short story here has hard questions about how new the new man, the nowy człowiek, that was to inhabit the Soviet city of the future actually is. By doing so, he effectively illustrates how the issue of urbanization intersects here with a wider, well, no, it's going too fast, with a kind of wider social cultural vestiges, such here as the lingering legacy of patriarchy and its contestation. Socialist feminism, which was to challenge the fundamental fabric of Armenian society as it did elsewhere in the decades ahead. So together with Stepan Zoryan, author of The White City, published actually 1 year after Armen's novel that we will talk about in a second, Armen stood here at the forefront of a new generation of young authors that in their writings turned to the urban in an effort to critically explore the possibilities, but also limits of achieving what he calls economic, physical, and spiritual emancipation and happiness of individuals through architecture. So here we can already identify the 2 central leitmotifs, if you want, that would animate his fascination with the city. The quest for social urbanity caught between a yearning for the pre-revolutionary world of the past and, to use the word of the philosopher Ernst Bloch, the forward-dawning futurity, Dämmerung nach vorn, of a new post-revolutionary world in the making. At the age of 25, he hopes for his breakthrough with the publication of a first full-fledged novel, Yerevan, a saga. In the novel, banned upon release by Stalin, so that's already a little bit of a spoiler, Armen seeks to make sense of the rapid urban transformations that rock the city since the advent of state socialism. Only 8 years ago, the book actually became accessible to wider Armenian public when it was republished by the Yerevan-based publisher house Antares. That is, more than 80 years after its initial publication. In Yerevan, Armen sets out to engage his reader in an intensive debate on Soviet urbanity and what it means to make yourself at home in modernity. Yerevan here introduces the reader to Arshak Budakyan, fictitious young architect. The novel here weaves a complex plot centered around Budakyan's dream of building his commune house, which he tellingly calls Nor Arevelk. So Nor Arevelk translates, of course, as the New East. And the notion here is very interesting because it ties in with a wider movement prominent in the early Soviet period of artists, for example, a term that in its Russian variant as Novi Vostok, we encounter also within the Uzbek avant-garde, for instance. So this is kind of an interesting kind of shiver that ties in with a larger, one could say, like pan-Soviet debate, specifically in the Soviet South. His quest here unfolds against the backdrop of a fierce struggle against his opponent, the city's chief tenant, Gurgen Parsavyan. The latter, in return, bears uncanny resemblance with Alexander Tamanyan. We'll see this as we further proceed in the story. And on the outside, Budakyan appears like a freshly minted new post-revolutionary subject. Yet his inside reveals a highly conflictual and ultimately also tragic personality. Budakyan is caught here between aspirations of the future city, the Kommunashen, and a deeply rooted yearning for the old city that is coming to naught, that is razed to the ground before his own eyes. So in a dreamlike sequence, he revisits his native district of Nork. The choice of the district here is hardly coincidental. The vernacular Persianate era district, inhabited here by a mix of Christian and Muslim populations, was precisely one of those vernacular settlements similar to Kont, which were an eyesore to Tamanyan and his vision of the Western-style neoclassicist garden city, or Goratsav in Russian. So as Arshak roams as it is framed in the novel, the capriciously wide streets of his native district, it more and more dawns on him that to construct the new Soviet Armenian city will inevitably lead him to irrevocably destroy what Armen calls the existing city of the sun, Arevelk. The sun here hints, of course, at Yerevan's Persian legacy, for it symbolized Persian status. So we have the Shir of Khorshid, so the lion, and the king, of course, as the central symbolism for both the Safavid and Shah Empire, actually even predating both empires. In short, he's deeply torn. On the one hand, he recognizes that the former imperial city was a place of extreme inequality. An affluent center stood in contrast to a suburban periphery, the Kahaki Ansanot Masse, the unknown part of the city, as he frames it, where the enslaved people, I'm quoting here from the novel, had lived for centuries away from the eyes of the Khans and Aras. On the other hand, however, he realizes that a century-old Yerevan is dying. Mernume hin Taravor Yerevan. Grief-stricken by this task to demolish his own native district of Nor, Budakyan decides to hold a party at his neighbor Gavo. So the night prior to the demolition of the district, he gathers all fellow enthusiasts of old Yerevan, listeners of Ashik Hafizadeh, customers of Alakber Hassan Olo, admirers of Zubaydah, that's a direct quote from the novel, to participate in a symbolic funeral for the city. So it's very interesting here. I want to make another kind of shortcut here to another of his short stories, because when you look at Armen's stories, you can see how basically the idea that would then ultimately animate his novel is slowly building up through his short stories published a couple of years before. So for example, when you look at the short story Red Square, we see already this motive of the dying city. That is a recurrent motive that we see actually in both the story of the Red Square and the Yerevan novel. However, what's interesting here is that in the story of the Red Square, this death of the city is actually portrayed in with a quite different affective tuning. Here we talk is actually no problem. So in that story, the main protagonist is not any Armenian architect, but actually a young Muslim girl from Yerevan, which basically leaves behind her suburban home by the river for the glimmers of electric lights, of downtown Yerevan. And what's interesting here to kind of give you a kind of sense of the effective tuning and how that will be quite in contradiction to what we will see in Yerevan, which is much more, I would say, a melancholic novel. Here, do you see the picture on the wall? That is New Yerevan, and that red square, that is a large building to be constructed in your neighborhood, in the place of your home. So the interesting thing here, however, is that this does not actually, in some sense, instill any sense of melancholy, sorrow in the main protagonist. The main protagonist is actually enthusiastic that her vernacular era district will be razed to the ground and replaced by new communist housing. And here we see, interestingly, that in the novel, the only protagonist or antagonist to mourn the death of the old Yerevan are actually the frogs croaking in the river. They are literally the only other. These are the other. But what's interesting here now, when we shift from here to the Yerevan novel, that now the other, that is the antagonist to the city as it is envisaged by the main urban planner, is the main protagonist of the novel himself. So we see that here the four instruments that play this death march in the scene of the Mahman Kailergi, I think it's one of the really the most interesting and I think scenes of the novel. They all refer actually the Kamanje, Zurna, Dao, Tar. They all refer to music instruments which have been widespread not only in Armenia but across the vast Persianate geography from the Caucasus to Iran and ultimately up until Central Asia. However, with the arrival of the first construction workers, the elegy is soon drowned out by the deafening sound of the pickaxe, whose rhythmic hammering heralds the irrevocable destruction of the old. Of course, to hold such a funeral for the deceasing city, the deceasing pre-Soviet city, obviously challenges the hegemonic discourse of progress associated with Stalin's Soviet Union. Instead, however, it paints a multi-layered and conflictual picture of how contemporaries experienced and reacted to rapid changes in their urban environment. But even after the symbolic funeral, the mnemonic specter of the old city lingers on. In every small house, he comes to see the fragment of a shattered dream. He seeks to preserve and piece together the memory fragments left behind by the old city in the hope of reconstructing the old in a new patchwork-like city. And the opportunity to do so actually arises in the novel when Budakian is commissioned to submit plans for a future commune house. Soon, however, after he takes on the project, however, a fierce competition erupts between him and the de facto Tamanyan, Kurgan Parsedian. His opponent's counter-project bears also the name of Hachdanak, victory, which rings Western hubris and is animated by a love for ancient Greece. In contrast, Budakian subscribes to the city's more Islamo-Persian heritage. Addressing the former residents of Nork, his native district, he reassures that they will once again, I quote here, find your flat roofs the ideal retreat during the sweltering summer months. Your cherished trees, vibrant flowers, and flowing waters are here to welcome you. Long live the East. Filled here with enthusiasm, he conjures up the internationalist vision of, I quote here, bringing the architects of Georgia, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan to Soviet Armenia to build an earthly paradise for Ishchis and Fakhlis. He specifically here uses both the Arabic and the Turkish loan word, of course, workers and peasants, if we translate it. And here, I think at the kind of peak of this post-revolutionary enthusiasm, I quote, once pilgrims came to Yerevan to see the Blue Mosque, soon other pilgrims will take with them the image of a dream fulfilled. to Persia, Tajikistan, Afghanistan, Egypt, Syria, Palestine. They, as new dervishes, will tell the Muslim East where the real paradise is. So Yerevan as the red Mecca of a secularized East. However, there's always a but to it. The ensuing construction process turns out quite sobering. Limited production possibilities hampered the realization of his architectural vision. It's actually interesting because he was actually accused for not writing a social realistic novel, but I think this is a very social realistic ending of the novel. So in the end, the fundamental conceptual differences of the both antagonistic architects boil down to, I quote from the novel here again, cabinets resembling cigarette boxes with a matchbox on top for Parsadian, and cabinets resembling mosque entrances with an arched door and a painted brick color for Budagian. What was built in the end turns out to be a far cry from the new Eastern city he imagined. At the very end of the novel, we find the sentence, the idea was defeated, Shams is lost, the East is lost. The meaning of Shams here remains quite cryptic and can be read here, of course, in multiple ways. One way is quite literally in Arabic as the sun, as Shams, and thus another allegory of the city of the sun. Another one is a possible allusion also to Shamsi Tabrizi, the vagabond that inspired Persiphil Sufi Jalaluddin Rumi to compose his Divani Shams. But what is behind Budagian's quest for the East? We shall see. It is more than only love for the revolution. Just, and we are familiar of this story plot already from his previous story on the Kommunashen. As it was true for Anahit in his previous short story, we encounter again a quest for love that runs parallel to the quest for the socialist city. Though this time it is not love for Anahit, an Armenian woman, but instead for Asma. From Arabic Ismara, literally tan, dark-skinned, Asma is introduced here as the daughter of an affluent Turkic Türkan. It's always the question how to translate that. A tradesman who turned into a widow after the untimely death of her husband. She resides in a luxurious and richly decorated Oriental house in Nork. And here we see now the small cross references, I think, to Baudelaire and other writings from the 19th century. So frequent nightly visits by an amorphous group of people from Persian traders to old mullahs suggest here to the reader that after the demise of her husband, she earns a living basically as a sex worker. Upon her encounter with Budagian, she disvirgins him, leaving the young protagonist craving for love and affection. Heartbroken, he ultimately leaves to pursue his studies, however, in Soviet Russia. After championing his academic and occupational tribulations in Moscow and Leningrad, the aspiring young architect is called back to his original point of departure, Yerevan. After his arrival, however, he is overcome by pangs of nostalgia and seeks out for Asma in the urban maze of Nork. So Asma, here plotted as a wealthy widow older than the main protagonist, brings of course to mind a kind of femme fatale version of Khadija, the successful businesswoman, widow to two, and first wife to the Prophet Muhammad. Read together, this in some sense makes the protagonist again, and we see it a lot as we saw it in the previous quote on like Yerevan as the new Mecca, a kind of secular, in some sense almost satire of Islamic history. So we see him as a kind of secular prophet who leaves for exile, in the sense here Soviet Russia, to return with the promise of redemption. But what is this promise of redemption? So the realization of her likely death, so he revisits Asma's house, but instead, in lieu of her former house, he encounters a dilapidated ruinscape, which prompts him to conclude that Asma must have perished in his absence. The realization, however, of this likely death prompts the crucial turning point of the novel. Instead of giving in to his sorrow about the loss of Asma, the main protagonist instead sublimates his grief. By doing so, he unleashes a force within himself that would from then on drive his entire architectural endeavor. And here we return back to the socialist city from the love plot and inscribe it into the very urban fabric of the future city. I quote it from the novel. I think it's a very interesting quote. But who is this Asmar of which he's dreaming of Buddha-Gyan thought? Is she that woman? No. This Asmar is an idea that he's trying to implement. The idea of the New East, the no Arevelk. So through this act of sublimation, Asmar is stripped of her material existence as the lover that perished, and turns into a allegorical image for both the city lost and found. As a free variable parameter, her memory here bridges across the legacy of the old Persian city and the utopia of the new Eastern socialist city. In some sense, there are several indications that Arshak Buddha-Gyan's quest of Asmar is here modeled on a secularized version of the suluk, the form of spiritual wayfaring or traveling in Sufi Islam, by which the traveler, the salik, returns to the source of his existence. In this sense, it's Asmar as the impersonation of the East. So most illustratively, this becomes in a dream sequence in the second half of the book, when the main protagonist proclaims, "I'm your new poet, Ashuk and Dervish," and uses here also interestingly Shair for poet, not Banastets, the Arabic word for poet. Read in this vein, his urban quest for the city of the New East acquires here more intimate and unexpected meaning, constructing the new city as an attempt to bring back to life Asmar as a memorial reified in brick and stones this time. So we remember this and we're familiar with this kind of trope already from his short story on the Hovannisian at the beginning. It is again the memorial, the Hushatzan, which Aram already dreamed of erecting for Alahid before. Yet the memorial of this novel is not for an Armenian woman, but for the ultimate national Allah, the Muslim Turkic Asmar. So through this construction of the commune house, it is the post-Persianate remains of a multi-ethnic Yerevan which are to shine again, though this time in the splendor of international solidarity, or as Mkrtich Armen puts it in the novel, "Oh, if Asmar comes, she will bring along with her all the architects of Georgia, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and Turkmenistan." So Asmar assumes here definitely the role of a kind of international savior figure who promises to redeem a geography which continues to be torn by inter-ethnic conflict to this very day, as we know. So, however, disembodied from the physical person of Asmar, this imaginary Asmar bears here resemblance with Walter Benjamin's idea of the Ur-image. In a fragmented note of his Passagenwerk, or Arcade's work in English, that opens with a quote by Jules Michelet, "Chaque époque rêve la suivante," or every epoch dreams of the one that follows. Benjamin argues that the dreaming collective, das träumende Kollektiv, of modern society here in the act of anticipating its own possible futures, that is the futures outlined in the novel, is encountering suddenly flashes or images, as he calls it, of its own repressed pre-capitalist past. Yet Susan Book-Morton, I think here again I was jumping too fast, in her elaborate study of Benjamin's unfinished arcade work, cautions that this must not be understood in a way that past myths themselves may serve as blueprints for an anticipated future. Instead, Ur-images in Benjamin's writings rather occupy here the position of dream symbols, and as such, I quote, "They provide the motivation for future emancipation, which will not be literally a restoration of the past, that is a restoration of the Persian past that predated the Soviet period, but will be based on new forms." And it is precisely the same way that Armen here relates to Asmar in the old Eastern Yerevan, and as rather than a resurrection of the past is here more understood as a kind of mobilizing force for future emancipation, which drives the protagonist not to simply restore a nostalgic image of the pre-Soviet past. Instead, Asmar motivates him to transcend the arresting image of what is in the novel portrayed as a Western-centric present. I think the notion of Eurocentrism didn't exist at the time the novel was written. Represented here clearly by Parsadian's / Tamanyan's Stalin favorite architecture of neoclassicism, in favor of another form of urbanity, that is the urbanity of the New East, as it is framed in the novel, that, according to the author, may sublate the city's past. And here, in a distinctly Hegelian sense of the word, The word sublate translates in German as both abolition and lifting up. This is Aufheben. The city means at the same time a fundamental break with the old city and its preservation and elevation through the new city. That's, I think, the idea behind it. Read, however, in this vein, Asma guides the main protagonist out of the obscurity of what is framed in the novel as a Western-style modernization, which is embodied by the quest of Parsadian, but here not back into the realm of post-Persian nostalgia. That is the thing, that is the break that takes place, I think, after the funeral scene, but towards the horizon of an alternative futurity that is framed as the socialist East. So, a century later, and I'm coming here already to the end of my talk, in a fundamentally reconfigured and I would say distinctly more pessimistic and post-utopian world, Asma's city of the New East lingers on as a haunting specter of our own present. Just like Derrida's Specters of Marx, this internationalist or cosmolocal city that wasn't, I think it both signifies a return to what has never taken place. The city as envisioned by Armen was never built, and the arrival of what is no longer to come after the ultimate and irrevocable end of the Soviet project. So in a world of rising ethno-national particularisms, the specter of this internationalist city may indeed appear invisible, the more so in face of the current conflict we're witnessing. But if the specter is invisible, it is not for want of showing itself. It is, on the contrary, as Derrida argues, always already there, invisibility itself transpiring as a lack and a void. Or, put it less highbrow at the very end of a very long working day, I will borrow here again from my former mentor and colleague at the University of Michigan, Ronald Sunny. Let's not mistake the present for the future. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much. Thank you for a fascinating talk. The talk is now open for questions from those who are in the audience, as well as on Zoom. So, Anush, now, can they hear for question or should the question be repeated?
No, they can hear.
Hang on, please.
They can hear.
Oh, okay, please go ahead.
Thank you, David. That was a really fascinating talk. I loved it. I love all of the imagery, and you have so many wonderful turns of phrases. The city of the future. I mean, I couldn't write down fast enough, so I'm looking forward to your book. But I wanted to ask about the novel, which you mentioned was banned for a long time and was recently republished 8 years ago. And I'm wondering if you have any ideas about how it is resonating in Yerevan today with all the new construction. So you're talking about, obviously, demolition and construction from, almost a century ago, and now we're seeing similar waves of demolition and construction. So I was wondering if you could talk about that, this novel being republished now at this time.
Oh, yeah, thanks a lot for the question. Good question. It's when one doesn't immediately know how to answer to it. I think what's fascinating about the book indeed is that it vanished and that it's almost like a time travel from another time, right? Because at the time when Mkrtich Armen wrote the novel, the demographic composition, obviously, of Yerevan was quite differently from what it was today. And for that reason, also what one could call a kind of banal internationalism, in the sense of people just coexisting, not necessarily as a fairy tale story, is something that was just a relatively banal reality for the author that inhabited Yerevan and that grew up actually in Gyumri, another city marked by a distinct multi-ethnic composition. So I think what's interesting about the book is that it really came out of the past. In some sense, it was republished thanks to the series Arevelk banned books. So Antares has a specific series, they, among others, also published, for instance, also Elif Shafak's book, which was published due to reference to the genocide in Turkey. And I think that this is really something that sparked more debates, because it's not that no one was critically engaging with Tamanyan's project. Actually, Levon Abraman, the article that I quoted, was published before the book was republished. But it was only, I think, really after the republishing of the book that these topics became more widely discussed. And I think specifically also, I think the kind of reappreciation of Kant changed a lot. I think Kant was just definitely a district that was, when I came first to Armenia, maybe in 2011, rather regarded as a kind of marginalized, exiled sites at the very fringes of what is the imagination of today's city. And I think it's really also ties in with this kind of turn or interest in this pre-Soviet city as such, that the book now strikes a chord, I think, with some. And I think it's very interesting also to follow up the current discussions going on in Armenia on the book, actually. And however, I think it might be interesting to look at these short stories, which have been not republished. I mean, yeah, thanks a lot.
Maybe I will offer one, although it's more from the architectural perspective. So you mentioned that Tamanyan's structures in some ways early on were more prefabricated structures. Is that correct? And if so, I mean, were some of them damaged extensively during the earthquake in the late 1980s and so forth? Could you comment on that?
Okay, right. No, I think to my knowledge, like there was not major harm to construction by Tamanyan in Yerevan, to the fact that the earthquake mainly hit Specter and then also Gyumri by extension. That's basically
So
already the answer and to this.
Do you know if there is any kind of application of current earthquake standards in reinforcing such structures? Because, you know,
It's
the
interesting.
whole country is.
Thanks a lot for bringing up this question, even though it's not tying in with this chapter, but with another chapter of my research, actually, because I was specifically working on earthquake security, but with regard to Bishkek. However, the two cases are very similar. And the problem is basically that that with regard to Yerevan, Armenia was not regarded, and that was one of the fatal miscalculations of Soviet basically leadership, as a earthquake-prone region. Unlike parts of Central Asia, for example, like buildings which were built, and that's the interesting irony, like buildings that Panelki, like prefab housing that was built in Central Asia, and for example Bishkek at the same time they were built in Gyumri, were built actually earthquake resilient in Central Asia, and not earthquake resilient in Armenia, because of the kind of fatal miscalculation with regard to which regions were regarded as earthquake proof or not. But to my knowledge, it is, at least I do not know about Armenia, but I worked specifically on current day earthquake security in Bishkek, because the book focuses mainly on Bishkek and Yerevan. In Bishkek, there is a absolute neglect regarding earthquake-proof housing. And I think that's something what I heard also with regard to Yerevan, but Yerevan I didn't scientifically work on that yet, so I cannot say it. But I know, for example, in Bishkek that there's also a trend towards building buildings like the so-called elite keys and new luxurious housing on the very Isikata fault line. So that is the fault line actually of two tectonic plates, which was regarded as a no construction zone during the Soviet period. So with Armenia, one of the problems, I think a very acute problem, is the tunnels that are connecting actually Aram Street with the Children's Railway, which actually currently are really endangering all of the construction that are built above the tunnels, because they are acute, facing the danger of actually collapse even without earthquakes. So one would not want to think of that. And all this, that's important, like all the Khrushchev era, Brezhnev era, Soviet era constructions were all not built in according with earthquake-proof building construction technologies. Not even the earthquake-proof construction technologies that were available to Soviet architects in, for example, Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, where this technology was further applied, actually.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Yeah.
I actually have a question about the short story that you covered earlier, Hovannisian. And you mentioned that Mkrtich Armen, like born in Alexandropol and taught in Central Asia and then in Yerevan. So that the field he saw in his dream would that would turn into Hovannisian. How cosmopolitan international did he imagine it? Was it in Soviet Armenia or a more broader abstract Soviet space?
About the Hovannisian, we do not learn too much in the short story, actually, because that's where he first develops the notion. But I think he really flashes it out and fills it with kind of cultural life in the novel in Yerevan, actually. So I think what was interesting, what I tried to point out in the novel, is that the main antagonist, that is the other to the Soviet project, is kind of shifting from a Armenian other to a Turkic other. I think that's an interesting shift, but in both cases they are in some sense resembling vestiges of the old world, and not only changes this kind of like content of the other, but his own effective relationship to the other changes, which I tried to show. So in his short stories, the very early short stories, which are actually written around 5 years apart from the novel, so we don't speak about the long period, are very much informed by a very triumphalist understanding of the Soviet modernity project, basically, where basically he's just, and that's also something one would want to, what would one expect to find from a novelist who is said to have been deeply admiring the Manifesto of the Three by Chavins and the Futurists. So this is, but the interesting thing, the shift that happens is the interesting shift from the short stories to the novel, because there we see suddenly a kind of nostalgia or retrotopia emerging, like a kind of different relationship to the very destruction of the old, which is then dramatized with the main protagonist, which is the perfect dramatic character in the sense that he's both longing for the city that is razed to the ground, and he's the main responsible architect to basically demolish the city that he is, that another part of his longing. So I think it's the perfect, in some sense, dramatization of a kind of split personality that defines the post-revolutionary subject. I think that's how at least I interpret. Yeah, Armen?
So I was doing a little homework before coming to see you, and I was reading about how Mkrtich Armen was sent to Siberia for a little while for running afoul of the authorities. I was just curious, are these texts that you covered, are these examples of how he ran afoul of the authorities, or is this a little too subtle?
I think it's exactly this break from his short stories to the novel. The short stories were actually very much hailed by critics, so it's also an interesting shift. And the critics who kind of censored or banned the novel seemingly quite clearly understood what the novel was about and what the novel was, in which way the novel was different from the short stories. But what's interesting about Mkrtich Armen, thanks for bringing this up, because it's something that I didn't address in the work, because I focus more on his works than his biography, is that actually he makes his comeback, but without the novel. So the thing is, he is rehabilitated, like also and I didn't talk about this, so the main protagonist is actually no one else than Mikhail Mazmanyan. This is a great also work by Grigoryan on Mazmanyan's life. So basically the main protagonist is a fictionalized character of Mikhail Mazmanyan, a leading constructivist architect and also opponent to Alexander Tamanyan. And the interesting thing is that both this architect that serves as a role model for his main protagonist in the novel and Mkrtich Armen get actually excited to Siberia almost at the same time. So, and the interesting thing, however, is that both persons, both the architect that serves as a role model for the novel and Mkrtich Armen become rehabilitated in the post-Stalinist period, return both to Armenia, and both become part of the nomenclature of Khrushchev era Soviet Union. However, the novel never gets republished. Mkrtich Armen becomes a kind of highly decorated writer as the novelist of Helena as founder, which is taught, I think, in schools throughout the Soviet, I think also post-Soviet period, I assume. But this novel becomes basically erased from his from his repertoire until the republication of the novel. So that's the interesting thing. And with Mikhail Mazmanyan, who is the architect that serves as the role model for the protagonist, happens the same. Like his early experimental buildings never will be realized. Those who are realized become largely marginalized. So, for example, one of the largest constructivist building residential unit is in current day Yerevan. I think not even many people in Yerevan are really aware of it because it's not figuring in the kind of narrative of today's city. It's right actually at the Garagin metro station. But he would come back, and actually in his late writings, he would expand the city faithful to what he calls a continuation of Tamanyan's plan. So we see actually a kind of like rolling back on his earlier, more critical attitude. So, yeah. Thanks a lot. This is a really important question.
Debo has a question on
Oh, yeah, sure.
Yeah, thank you very much, David. Very interesting presentation, a lot of food for thought, especially for non-specialists. My question to you has to do with it's more like a comment than a question. The comment has to do with the larger kind of the larger picture of what you're presenting in terms of Yerevan in relation to Armenian history and Armenian collective identity as a in general. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because Armenian identity, as many of us know, has a very Janus face kind of appearance. On the one hand, it has one face facing the west, and it has another face obviously facing the south and the east. And this is a binarism that Nina Garsoyan, as well as a number of other scholars, have pointed out, that it begins with Greco-Roman influence, with the Roman Empire, versus Persian or Iranian, Parthian, Sasanian influence, and then the sides change identities. So instead of Greco-Roman, you have other Western interests, Western identities later on, Christianity, etc., versus an Perso-Islamicate identity and an Ottoman kind of identity that leaves an indelible shape as well on Armenian on the Armenian position in the world as a whole. Listening to your lecture, it made me think that Yerevan is the kind of condensation of this transhistorical observation about Armenian identity as being somewhat dualistic, but in a way that harmonizes both these elements. It's neither Western nor Eastern. It's its own, but it's a hybridized identity that is a melange of both Perso-Islamicate and Western. But of course, the people who do the melanging almost always think of themselves as Western and having nothing to do with the East. I'm wondering if you want to comment on the larger is there any traction between Yerevan as a small microsite of something much larger, at the risk of making essentializing generalizations about Armenians that are transhistorical? But it did cross my mind that there is this kind of Janus face-like element in Yerevan's design itself, and the West or the new future is replacing the past, which is Perso-Islamicate.
Yeah, thanks a lot. And I think we have in the line that runs from the opera to the cascade, we have maybe the whole complexity and in some sense also conflictual urban identity maybe summed up in one spatial arrangement, right? We start from the Tamanyan's opera, which is, I think, the Western neoclassicist building par excellence. But we reach the cascade, and the cascade is actually largely borrowing from this notion of like the hanging gardens.
Yeah.
Which ultimately then leads us throughout the steps to the eternity symbol. However, and that I think is also quite symptomatic, the immediate steps that would represent actually the leap from the present to the future is a dilapidated and abandoned construction site. So there was actually kind of this interesting sentence I overheard when like there was some two, I think, Russian, maybe new migrants who arrived to the city who were like looking and said like "Что-то строение достроили." So something was built, and "достроить" is a nice verb, like it was not built towards completion. So it was built, but it was not completed. And I think that this, in some sense, I think the cascade in some sense might be a wonderful reification of this unreconciled and maybe also unfulfilled urban vision, or kind of an unfulfilled reconciliation of these, if one wants to work with these stereotypical poles of East and West. But I definitely, in this sense, think that it's also one of the reasons why I find it interesting to revisit the 1920s, because what really draws me to this novel, and also maybe I should mention this for those who had no chance to listen to my talk at Michigan at the beginning. I was there specifically talking more about the architecture. I was looking at what Mkrtich Armen was doing in his writings. Mikhail Mazmanyan, Karo Halapian, Gevokot Kocha aspired to do in construction. That is a kind of way that construes a, one could say, cosmo-local architecture. That is an architecture both rooted in the region's vernacular architecture, while at the same time tying in with the wider trends of larger constructivist Neubau, like this is like modern architecture. So I think what is really interesting about the 1920s is that we see that what would then later on be understood as a rather canonized idea of Armenian culture was not yet settled. I think that was interesting. It was still a space of negotiations and a space of fierce contestation. And it is only in retrospect that we now look back at a really clearly defined and distinctly more Western notion of Armenianness that was Hayotsun, that was really forged in this period. So in some sense, it's a kind of also, one could say, deconstruction or kind of archaeology of also modern Armenian national identity, at least as it was forged and construed in the Soviet context, and to show the kind of room of maneuver, the room of exploration that did exist until the shift towards Stalinism. And in some sense, again, coming back now to the initial reference to the cascade, we see in some sense a little bit this return towards the discourse of the East coming back, because Cascade is, for example, a building constructed by Jim Torosian. So we see that some parts of this, let's say, abandoned vision of a Yerevan that looks both to the West and the East is coming back in some of the second wave modernist architecture that we see in the late Soviet Armenia and late Soviet Yerevan. So I think that's the kind of interesting thing and the thing that drew me to this topic.
Are there other questions from the audience? Yeah.
I had one question. Thank you so much, Doctor, for the wonderful talk and for coming here. I wanted to ask, I'm sorry if this is a bit of a basic question, but I wanted to ask a little bit about the context in which Mkrtich Armen was making these, expressing his alternate view about the development of Yerevan as a new city. I wanted to ask, how unique was his his view about, was he kind of a lone voice in expressing these questions and these perhaps doubts about the new vision of Yerevan as it was being built in the 20s and 30s, or maybe was it just one way that he expressed his criticism? I know you mentioned there were opponents of Taiwan's vision. And so how did this fit into, I guess, a broader debate about Yerevan's development as an urban landscape?
Yeah, thanks a lot. Well, I think it was a relatively organic environment of both writers. So we think here also, for instance, of China. It's like China's Name, so his kind of play of the Persian genre of the poetry, like Hafiz, Shahnameh. And so we see also this kind of fascination with part of the Persian, Islamo-Persian culture with other writers, so it's like a kind of unrivaled, I think, the Soviet Armenian writer. However, also with regard to these persons, we see different kind of perspectives on Armenian culture throughout their biographies. So, for example, it's not exactly the answer to the question, but I will come back to your question. The interesting thing is that the very Mikhail Mazmanyan, who would be the architectural variant of what we see here in writing, is an architect who, at the time when Mkrtich Armen is composing his book, is actually building a constructivist style residential district in Yerevan for the workers of the rubber factory. But the interesting thing is why the front facade of the buildings are basically testifying to a borrowing from, the larger tropes of modern constructivist architecture. The backyards actually borrow from the so-called Italian houses in Tbilisi, that is the hometown of Mikhail Mazmanyan. So he borrows from the Persian era architecture of Persian era Tbilisi. So we have this kind of also wooden backyards with kind of half-open sun visors called similar to the Persian Shanashil. Also with hose, with the water basins in the backyards. So we see in terms of the spatial organization that also architects, and that's the thing which I try to bring together in the chapter, both architects and writers were in some sense experimenting with the question of, is there a future for the eastern part of Yerevan in the new socialist project? So yeah, in some sense it was part of a larger, and what is something that I have not looked into deep is to which degree it was also a trend in the wider so-called quote-unquote Soviet South. So because I know about the notion of the Novi Vostok, the New East, also being used in the context of the Uzbek avant-garde. And you have also these kind of persons that could biographically form circuits. So for example, Nikolai Karabakh, the Karabakh Artsakh-born painter, actually would become one of the leading figures of the so-called Uzbek avant-garde. So the question is also, who were the persons that through which these notions maybe of the New East traveled from Armenia to Uzbekistan? I don't know it yet, but yeah, that's a very important question actually. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Okay, any other questions from the audience in person or the Zoom audience? Okay. Very good. Well, thank you. Let's all thank our speakers. So thank you again so much for coming all the way out to the United States and to UCLA. We're grateful to you, David, for your lectures, your 3 lectures. So let me just close our event by noting that we have a number of upcoming events that are hosted or co-sponsored by the Promise Armenian Institute at UCLA. In fact, next week on Friday, October 18, in the Hmong Conference Center on the UCLA campus, we have our 2nd annual Endowed Kerr Family Lecture. Many of you remember the one last year delivered by Ani Hovannisian with an introduction by her father, late Richard Hovannisian. This next lecture is entitled The Very Limit of Our Endurance, Reverend Hovannisian and his network of resistors during the Armenian genocide. And this will be delivered by Dr. Khachig Mouradian, a lecturer in Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University. He is also the Armenian and Georgian area specialist at the Library of Congress, U.S. Library of Congress. Introductory remarks for his lecture and the historical context will be provided by Dr. Antranik Dekessian, who is a faculty member in Armenian Studies at Hovannisian University in Beirut. This event will be held in person, but it will also have Zoom webinar access as well as live streaming on YouTube. As many of you are aware, our annual Kerr Family Lectures are designed to amplify the stories of heroes and heroines who dedicated themselves to saving and supporting victims and survivors of violence and mass atrocities in times of crisis. And so this year's focus, as I mentioned, is on Reverend Iskidjan, who is the namesake of the Ararat Iskidjan Museum, well known to those of us in Southern California in particular. And it is his pioneering, life-saving efforts that were instrumental in saving many lives and laying the groundwork for future life-saving efforts during and after the Armenian genocide. On Saturday, November 2nd, at the University of Southern California, the USC Dornsife Institute of Armenian Studies is hosting an all-day conference entitled Artsakh Uprooted, Aftermaths of Displacement. The UCLA Promise Armenian Institute is a co-sponsor of this event in an ecumenical spirit. Soon after that, on Monday, November 4 at 6 p.m. in this room in Bunch Hall, the Promise Armenian Institute's Armenian Genocide Research Program, led by Dr. Taner Akjam, will host a lecture delivered by Ilke Yilmaz of the Free University of Berlin entitled Ottoman Passports, Security and Geographic Mobility, 1876 to 1908. So more details on this upcoming hybrid event can be found at our website. And finally, on Friday, November 15, at 6:30 p.m. in the Bridges Theater on the campus, Promise Armenian Institute is very happy to co-host with the Armenian Film Foundation a screening of Michael Hagopian's recently remastered film entitled Strangers in a Promised Land. This is an hour-long documentary that tells the story of struggles of the first Armenian settlers in Fresno as they tried to create a new homeland in the legendary Central Valley. The screening will be followed by a conversation and discussion with the well-known Fresno community leader who is actually featured in the film, which was made several decades ago, Mr. Brian Bedrosian. So again, please consult our Promise Armenian Institute website as well as social media for information on these upcoming events as well as other future events. And so before I close, let me thank once again Dr. Leupold for coming to us and speaking. Thank you to our ever-present Hasmi Bagdasarian, our Deputy Director of the Promise Armenian Institute, as well as assistants from Nanar Hartunian and Emily Glossian. So we look forward to seeing all of you at our future events for the Promise Armenian Institute. Have a good rest of the day or rest of the evening. Thank you.